So, welcome to another edition of Powering Up Your Market Research using various programs that are out there. And today I wanted to look at multiple choice options in Qualtrics and some of the problems that can cause with your data analysis and how to get around that using Microsoft Excel. So I'm going to show you how to set up a multiple choice option in Qualtrics first, and then basically how to export that data into Microsoft Excel. And you're going to see it's a little bit problematic to deal with on first instance, but I'm going to give you two solutions to get around it to analyze your data and basically provide some very simple statistics and make your life a lot easier. So what I've done is I've written a little question up in Microsoft Word, and that's going to allow me to copy and paste that question into Qualtrics. So let's have a look at Qualtrics. Here's what we eventually want to do. So let me show you how I created this using the Qualtrics software. First up, I'm going to insert a new question, and we obviously need to know, well, what's the text that you are using to ask that question of the respondent. So there we are. Which of the following brands have you purchased in the last 12 months? I'm going to copy that question, and it's simply copy and paste is a really nice feature of Qualtrics. And then obviously we want to have the options there. And here are my brands that I've selected: Revlon, L'Oreal, Estee Lauder, Clinique. And I'm just copying and pasting it. And a really nice thing that Qualtrics allows you to do is paste multiple options at one time. And so that's what the question looks like at the moment. But unfortunately, it's a single answer. So if I show you what that looks like, it says, which of the following brands have you purchased in the last 12 months? And at the moment, it's what they call a radio button or a single answer multiple choice option. We really want to allow the respondent to select more than one brand. So how do we set that up in Qualtrics? Well, the way to do it is simply you've got your multiple choice option and you've got 8 choices, but now you've got a response here that says rather than single answer, you'd like to have multiple answer. And you can see that the multiple choice options now are given to the respondent. So what we can do is, if you look at the preview of the question, which of the following brands have you purchased in the last 12 months? The respondent can say, yes, I've purchased Revlon, but not L'Oreal. I've purchased Clinique and Garnier. So they can pick more than one option in this case. And so that's what we mean by a multiple choice option. And we've now set that up in Qualtrics, and we're almost ready to go. So one of the issues that you've got there with the multiple choice option, and even for single answer options, is that the display of those brand names is always going to be in the same order. And that might lead to some sort of bias amongst respondents in terms of they often select the first brand or the last brand in those set of options. So what you'd like to do is randomize the display of options in the sense that each respondent hopefully will see a different order in which those brands appear. And then when we average across the respondents, that order effect should be randomized and washed out in our analysis. So we could also test for that if we really wanted to. And the way to set that up in Qualtrics is to use the randomization option. To do so, you click on the little cogwheel associated with the question, and you go down until it says randomization. Once you click on randomization, it opens up a new window for you, and you'll see that the default option is no randomization. And what we'd like to do is select the option that displays those answers in a random order, so that every single respondent is going to see the brands in a completely different order to any other respondent, and avoid these order effects and the bias that may be created by doing that. So one of the nice features in Qualtrics is it can actually generate some simulated data for you, which means that you can start to think about the type of analysis that you're going to do with the questions that you've already got without actually having any respondents. So the way in which you do this is to click on the Tools option, press on Review, and then Generate Test Responses. And it's up to you how many responses that you would like to generate. but 100 is actually a very good number to get a bit of variance across your data set. It really depends on how large your questionnaire is at this point in time. I've only got one question, so for the sake of running a test, I'm going to generate 100 responses. And so these are all hypothetical, and they're going to appear in my data set, and I can start thinking about how I'm going to work with this data that I've created. So I now want to export the data that I have, either simulated data that I've just generated or real data that's come from real respondents. I want to export that now into Excel for analysis. The way in which you do that in Qualtrics is to click on Data and Analysis, and over here you've got this Export and Import button, and you can see we've got data there ready to export. So if I click on the drop-down menu, the option that I'm looking for is Export Data. If I click on that, I'm given a whole range of different options by Qualtrics as to how I would like to store my data. Now, what we're looking for today is using Excel. We can use SPSS to download the data, and I would suggest looking at some of the additional options such as coding for missing values. Now, SPSS is really great because it takes the coding for you in terms of what each of those variables are represented and how they're represented in the data set. So for instance, is the number 1 in the question of marital status representing someone who's married, or is it someone who's married or single, I should say? And that's a really nice, quick and way to analyze your data if you have SPSS available. But we're using Excel. It's quite accessible to most people, and it gives us two options. We can either download all the fields using numeric values, such as the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or we can use the choice text as it appears in the data, and exactly as the respondent saw. I'm going to click on the use numeric values today, but obviously I'd encourage you to play around with the different options there. And you simply click on download once you've done that. And what it does, it starts to generate the table and allows you to download to your local hard drive for further analysis. So that's what we're going to do. So I've now opened up my data set in Microsoft Excel, and you can see it's got a number of variables, including the start and end date of the survey. So that's a good idea just to check when you started your survey and to start cleaning out those missing, those test responses. So all of these have the same timestamp because I generated 100 test responses. Now you can also see the respondent ID for coding there, a whole lot of different things such as latitude and longitude, but this is the question that we're focused on. Which of the following brands have you purchased in the last 12 months? And you've got a 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the first respondent, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 1, 3, 6. So in this instance, the respondent is selecting multiple options, but it's appearing all in one column. And that makes it really hard for analysis on face value. So I'm going to show you two methods by which we can analyze this particular data. So there's a real need to understand what each of those values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 represent. Now there's two ways in Qualtrics to check that. You can click on the individual question which you're interested in and click on the cogwheel once again, and this time click on recode values. And you can see how the variable is being coded and therefore exported to Excel or SPSS. In this case, it's in order of the way in which we presented it in the question when we first set it up. So you can see that anyone who put a 1 indicated that they purchased Revlon in the last 12 months. Anybody who put a 6 is indicating they've purchased Dove in the last 12 months. You can also change the recoding values there. If you, for instance, wanted to give the number 1 to Dove, you're more than welcome to do that and change it to, say, the 876544321. You could give them entirely different or arbitrary numbers because in this case we have a nominal variable. The other way to check your coding is to export the survey to Word. And once you open up that tools option, with import export, you have a number of different options. Exporting the survey to Word is quite a good idea so that everyone has an idea of what was the question displayed to the respondent and how did the coding work. And you can see here that in brackets, we can see each of the values and what they represent and how they correspond to the different brands that were displayed. Once again, you can see that Revlon is represented by the number 1 in our data set for question 1. Dove is represented by the number 6 and Nivea is represented by the number 8. And you can see that as it is a multiple choice option, all of those selections are separated by a comma. So the question is, how are we going to deal with that? Okay, so the first technique that I'm going to use to analyze this data and to set it up is to use the text to columns feature in Microsoft Excel. So what I've done is I've taken the column of interest into a separate spreadsheet and I've labeled it Q1. And that's a nice thing to do so that you're not interrupting the other spreadsheet at all. Because what you're going to see here is it expands that column over several columns and you're going to need a lot of room. So the way in which we do this is I'm going to copy and paste it just so you can see what's happening. And I'm going to start dealing with this column B. And what I'm going to do is to select that column and press on Data, Text to Columns. Now what Data Text to Columns feature does, it's a little wizard and it can help identify the separators that are used in your column. Now what it says here is that you've got delimited or fixed width. Fixed width may be that you know that these entries are perhaps 1 character wide or 2 characters wide or even 8 characters wide. But we can see here that the characters such as commas or tabs separate each of the fields being the first selected item, second selected item, third item, and so on. So let's click on delimited, click next, and the default option is to have the tab as a delimiter. We can see here in our data that each of the entries are separated by a comma, so I'm going to use that as my delimiter. And you can start to see what's going to happen is that it's going to separate into separate columns each of those entries identifying the comma as a delimiter. Now you could also have other delimiters such as a full stop or a period, but in this case it's sufficient just to use the comma. So let's see what happens when we use this wizard. We press next. It's asking us, did you want to tell Excel what the nature of those columns is? Is it general, is it text, is it date? And for the moment, I'm just going to leave that as finish, as general, I should say, and click on the button finish. All right, so now what you can see is, I'll make this a little bit smaller, is that each of the entries, here we had the person selecting 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it's now spread it across into those various columns. The person who selected 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 has been spread across into 8 columns. So there's a column for the first selection, the second selection, the third selection, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th column. And you can start analysing your data using that now. So the second approach I'm going to use is a little bit more complicated, but it might be useful so that you don't have to repeat that step of text to columns. Once you have a formula set up, you can apply it to lots of different variables in your data. So here, once again, I've created a spreadsheet just to isolate the variable of interest, and I've got that in my first column as it appeared in the data set. I've then entered the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 as a set of numbers that I'll be able to refer to when I'm building my formula. And the formula that I've used is to find particular text and report back whether it was found or not. And the function has 3 components. Let's have a look at what it does. First of all, it's finding the particular text of interest. In this case, I'm looking for the number 1. And that number 1 is always in row 2. So I'll put a $ in front of row 2 to always refer to row 2, whether I'm trying to find a 1 or a 2 or a 3, it's always going to look for whatever's in that second row, I should say. And for the moment, I'm keeping off the column so that as I copy the formula across, using relative referencing, it's going to change to B, C, D, E, F. Now, where am I looking for that particular number 1? I'm referring back to column A3, and I always want to refer to column A. I don't want to necessarily keep it fixed as an absolute reference to row 3, because I want that to be updated as I copy the formula downwards. I always wanted to refer to first row, so I'll put a column, so column A, $A, absolute reference, and relative reference, row 3, then it's going to change to row 4, row 5, row 6. Now, where in the text do I want to start looking? Well, I want to start looking immediately, so I'm going to use the number 1 here. If I change it and start looking at number 3, 4, 5, 6, it's not going to work because I want to start at the start of that particular text. So I press OK, and let's see what happens. It comes up with the error message value. In other words, it hasn't found the number 1. If I copy the formula across, you can see now that relative referencing is working very nicely. It's always looking for the number that's contained in row 2, in this case the number 2, and it's always looking in column A where my original data is. And this time it's found the number 2 in the first position. If I copy this across, it cannot find the number 3. It found the number 4 in the third position, 2, 4, so that's the third position. It found the fifth number, the number 5, in the fifth position. It found the sixth number in the seventh, the ninth, and the eighth. And let's just have a look at this number 8. It's looking for number 8, and it's looking for it in column A. And so that formula is working very nicely. The only thing is, when we copy this down, is going to have a whole lot of instances where it didn't find particular values. So we can see here, it cannot find the number 2. It cannot find the number 4. So what we'd like to do is improve the formula so it looks a little bit nicer. And essentially what I'm going to do now is add a little bit of an if statement. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the word if. If it's an error, I'm going to use the function isError. If it's an error, it hasn't found the number. All right, so what I'd like to say is, no, I didn't find the number. So I'm going to put the number 0. If I did find it, if that is reporting back that there is no error, so in other words, that statement of isError find is false, I'd like to say, yes, I found the number, and I'm going to use a dummy code to represent that, the number 1. So if we look at our formula for the if statement, isError is reporting back true if we've got this value, right? Hashtag value, it cannot find it, and it's going to report false if it actually found it in any of those positions. And now it's creating a dummy code based on the if statement. If it's found the value, report the number. If it hasn't found the value, report the value 0. If that can't find the value, report the number 1. So now when I copy across, can you see what happens to the number 3 in particular? It reports it back as a 0 because it didn't find it. It's replacing the 3, 5, 7, 9, 11 just simply with the numbers 1 because it has found it rather than not found it. And now I have a dummy coding for representing whether the person selected that option or not. What I'd like to do now is start analysing the data that I've prepared for analysis in terms of the number of people who selected the number brand 1, brand 2, brand 3, and so on. Now to do this, I often give myself a little bit of room at the top of my data just by simply inserting a couple of rows. And I've got a couple of options here. I could use the COUNTIF function to count the number of 1s or count the number of 0s. But because it is in terms of this binary variable, this dummy variable, 0s and 1s, I can simply sum up that column to understand the number of people who selected a particular brand. So I'll type in sum. Summing up the number of ones gives me the number of people in this data set who selected brand number 1. Summing up the second column tells me that 68 people selected brand number 2. Selecting and copying the formula across to sum up this third column, I can see that a total of 70 people selected brand number 3 as being a brand that they purchased in the last 12 months. And I can copy that across and basically see that as a frequency count. So that now becomes my frequency count for the number of people who've selected that particular brand. Now I could also represent this in percentage terms. I basically need to know the number of selections that have been made. In this case, a total count is 507 selections were made. So it's not the number of people. The number of people is a little bit lower than that because people could have selected multiple entries. And you can see the number of people simply by typing in the value count. There's 100 people who made the selection, so on average they're selecting around about 5 brands. .07 brands have been selected as being purchased in the last 12 months. So what we don't know, of course, is what are those brands, and let's deal with that. So at the moment, we've got these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but we really don't know which brands they're referring to. So what we need to do is go back to our Qualtrics and see how that was coded. Now you have that in a Word document, basically because you've exported that before. And what I can do is copy those brands and the corresponding number in terms of how it was coded. So just a simple copy and paste and putting that on my spreadsheet. Now, if you copy and paste it normally, it'll bring up those icons to represent the multiple choice options. What you can do instead is paste it, but this time paste it as text. And so that won't interrupt the formatting of your Excel spreadsheet. The question mark is now representing what would have been those previous multiple choice options and the symbol there. We don't need that, but now we've got those the variable labels, or the response options I should say, running down as a column. Really what we'd like to do is run that as a header across our particular as a row. So what we need to do is select that, and this time we can copy and paste it, but there's a very particular nice thing that you can do in Excel is paste it as a special function. We're going to transpose it. I'll show you what that looks like using this paste special option. You've got different options to paste, and we're going to use the transpose function. And we can do that quite simply. Now, what that does is take anything that was represented as a column and now transpose it to be represented as a row vector. Now, you can also do this just simply by right-clicking and selecting the appropriate icon that says transpose. So by right-clicking, paste special, you can see my paste options is to transpose that particular data. And now we can see each of the brands that was selected very nicely. This is Revlon, L'Oreal, Estee Lauder, Clinique, Garnier, Dove, Gillette, and Nivea. And so that's a nice way of being able to know which brands were selected and by the number of people. So the final thing I'd like to do is display this in a graph. Now there's a number of different graphs that we could use, but essentially I'd like to use those brand names for representation of my data and the outcomes associated with this. I could use the frequency counts, but I'm going to convert these into percentages. So what I'm going to do is take the number 60 and divide it by the number of selections that were made. In other words, 60 people selected as one of the options that they purchased in the last 12 months. And so what I'm going to do is divide everything by 507. Because I always wanted to reference the 507, I'm going to press F4 and put dollars around both the column and the row reference. I'm going to multiply it by 100 so that it gives me the percentages by which those number of people had selected it. So this is basically the percentages by which the selections were being made. And we can see that once I can reduce the number of decimal places, and I can drag this formula across, and just to double check it, you can see that this is 65 divided by 507 gives me 12.8% of people had selected Nivea. Now you can see that as I select on this number adds up to 100. You can sum that up. So it is indeed a percentage of representation. Now there's a number of ways to graph this. If you select the data and go Insert, Charts, you've got a couple of different recommendations. You could do a column graph as one option, and you can see that Estee Lauder was the winner there. You could even put some data labels on top of it to see the percentage of people. You'd want to label your y-axis, you'd want to label your x-axis for the brands, and you'd obviously want to give it a chart title. You can also do a pie chart simply by clicking on Insert and Pie, and you can see the representation of the brands there. You can give those labels, of course, in terms of adding a data label, the percentages, or you can actually improve the data labels by looking at displaying the category names, and that's not a bad thing to have as well. So in other words, you can also put that in percentage terms. It already is in percentage terms, and take away the value, but that's a nice representation of the data with respect to a pie chart. And you can move obviously some of these call outs and have a call out representation of your data. So that's a basic way of looking at your data, now understanding the brands that were selected most often by people. Because this was simulated data, there's nothing really showing up as significant here, because on average you'd expect each brand to be equally likely to be chosen because we were using simulated data. But I hope, obviously, in your own data sets where you're using real respondents, you'll obviously get some different outcomes there. So that's a wrap. So you can see that we've taken once was a radio button style question where people could select only one option, and allowed people to respond by responding and selecting multiple options, a multiple choice type of question. What that showed up is when we exported the data into Excel from Qualtrics, it created all of that data into one particular variable, and it was all separated by commas, and it was very difficult to analyze. So we introduced you to two different ways of dealing with that data. First, by using the text to columns function in Excel, and the second was to create a formula using the find text. Once you'd done that, you could simply use those dummy variables to look at the data and to count the number of people who had made that selection versus the number who had not. And as a result, we could do some simple analysis with that by displaying it in terms of a bar chart or a pie chart. Of course, you could pick up on the averages for those variables just by using the average function, or any other way of looking at that data. It is very limited data in the sense that all you can do basically is look at the counts or the frequencies, and because it is nominal in nature. And hopefully you found this very useful, and we look forward to seeing you once again.